security guarantees tells us anything and everything that we need to know about what Putin's intent is going forward. The fact that he's being maximalist and saying that they really can't exist with any kind of meat to them tells you he is going to invade your country again. And that's got to be the starting point and the ending point for Ukraine in these negotiations. Putin is not done with you, no matter how much he may say, however much business he may do with with Trump in a, post-war period before he comes back at you again. But he's not done with Ukraine. He still wants it all.
Joining us today are retired U.S. Army Colonel John Sweet and foreign affairs and security policy expert Mark Toth. Welcome to our studio.
Thank you for having us back on the show, Sofia.
Great to be here. Thank you.
As we speak today, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Whitkoff has just landed in Moscow and is beginning talks with Vladimir Putin. Mark, what are your expectations for these negotiations?
Yeah, it's getting interesting, Sophia, because just as we're coming on air here, we've got word that the Chinese foreign ministry officials are showing up to these discussions as well. So that's the curve I don't think any of us were expecting. This was pitched as a meeting that Kushner and Whitkoff were going to present the latest version of Trump's peace framework to Putin and go from there. But it looks like suddenly the Chinese out of nowhere are getting a say in this potentially. But in terms of where they're going to go, where it's going to end up, I don't think much is going to change. Russia has been very notably trying to go back and say, look, nothing was decided in Alaska. We're confused. Our demands are the same. There's still maximalists. We still want concession of Ukrainian territory that our armies haven't taken. We still want no NATO in Ukraine, and NATO cannot accept any future Ukrainian membership. So basically, it just remains a maximalist position. I suspect that's going to be the outcome. There may be some nice spin to it. They may say, oh, look, it was great. We made progress, et cetera, on the American side. But I think basically we're still going to hear a loud niet coming from Putin and the Russian side.
Indeed, and as you already mentioned about Kushner, because Trump's son-in-law also traveled alongside Whitkoff to Moscow. What role does he play in this, as CNN calls it, unconventional negotiation team?
Right. It is unconventional, but, I would point out that U.S. presidents throughout history have taken unconventional approaches. Harry Hopkins did that for Roosevelt during World War II and negotiations with Britain and the like. Sometimes it's useful to have someone like a Jared Kushner who knows Trump on a more intimate level and could be maybe a little bit more predictive about where Trump is willing to go and what he's not to. So to have someone out there going, as a front person is not thing. It's just a question, though, of what his marching orders are and whether or not he can come back to Trump and say, look, candidly, Putin's not being there. Now, that's the positive spin. On the more negative side, I think what John and I are concerned about and others is that it looks like Whitkoff and Kushner are trying to set conditions for future business deals based on some of the leaks that are coming out of these meetings that has been widely reported. Especially in the Wall Street Journal and an op-ed that they did, this is more about making money than it is about getting a last and just a peace for Ukraine. So deeply concerning. But, at this point, there's two versions of his role. I tend to lean in towards the latter, unfortunately.
John, given the current situation on the battlefield, do you believe Putin is in a position to dictate terms both to Ukrainians and to Trump administration? Because yesterday, President of Ukraine, Zelensky, said that although Russian forces have made some advances, their losses are now at the highest point, 25,500 troops in a single month.
No, I don't think he has any leverage on the battlefield, to be honest with you. He has capability, don't get me wrong. He has mass. He has numbers that he can continue to throw into the battle, and we're seeing it. If you're on social media, you can't help but see all the videos of Russian soldiers, dead or dying on the battlefield, and the results of Ukrainian UAVs that are targeting them. But that said, he's losing upwards to 1,000 a day still, and he still has not captured a town he tells everyone that he has captured, Pokros. So no, he's trying to create a narrative that he's winning on the battlefield. He's trying to take that narrative that I'm winning and using it in negotiation and saying it's just a matter of time before I win. You should take the best offer I'm giving you now. when in fact, I don't believe he is winning. Now, he may be inflicting casualties. He may be taking a little bit of terrain, but where he's getting his most leverage right now is from the nonstop drone attacks against Ukrainian cities, the ballistic missile attacks against Ukrainian energy infrastructure. He is being successful there, in the narrative that he is pushing, that people are repeating, is having some effect. But on the battlefield, not winning, but I wouldn't say he's necessarily giving terrain, but he is taking large amounts of casualties, and it's undeniable that he's taking upwards to 1,000 a day. So how long he can continue that, I think he believes he can outlast Ukrainians' deep strikes with his tactical fights.
I've analyzed many statements coming from Russian officials, from Putin himself, and from foreign minister, and they're all striking a similar tone that the root causes of the war must be addressed first. And even today, a spokesperson of the Kremlin, President Putin, also said this, and they also claim that Moscow's position remains unchanged. John, from your perspective, do you think that what for Putin playing now, maybe to avoid angering Donald Trump with this negotiation?
First of all, the root cause of the conflict is nothing that Russia presents. Rather, it is Vladimir Putin. He is the root cause to the conflict. He's been the cause of the conflict since 2014, actually longer than that. So he is the problem. Now, everything he provides are excuses, or what he considers to be justifications. A Nazi regime, a country that wants to align with NATO. He throws out all these excuses to justify his actions. But at the end of the day, it's all about conquering Ukraine, securing those resources, right? And then the next step, which is going after the rest of what used to be the former Soviet empire. The Baltic states would be next, as will Moldova, Georgia, and Poland certainly is one of those countries that he's interested in too. So let's not kid ourselves. We know who the root cause is, and we know that the only way to stop the war is to stop Russia from attacking, because quite frankly, Ukraine's not going to stop defending. Now, unfortunately, from the Trump administration's perspective, they believe that in order to get the war to stop, they need to get Ukraine to stop resisting, and for Ukraine to accept a negotiated outcome, which is right now not in their favor by all counts, at least by the 28-point plan that we saw. And we're not necessarily sure exactly what the 19-point plan gave back, but I'm not confident that Ukraine is going to give the Donbass to Russia, because at the end of the day, Ukraine understands the significance of that terrain. They understand the strategic importance of that terrain, and how giving that to Russia only sets conditions for follow-on assaults onto their country. They've learned from Chechnya. It'd be nice if the West would also learn from Chechnya too, that Russia's not going to keep their word, that they're going to continue to build combat power, and they're going to come back at you. So, as Mark said, not a whole lot of expectations coming out of this next round of discussions in Moscow, but we will see.
Is Russia prepared to make any concessions, even something as limited as freezing the conflict along the current front lines, Mark?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. Look, when Putin says he wants to address the root causes, he's been saying this since day one. He wants to claim he's not at fault. He was forced into this. NATO made him do it. NATO expanded. He's not going to be making concessions at this point. He may make concessions on the business side of the equation in terms of future deals and the like, as enticements to get Trump and his side of the negotiating table to make concessions on their end. But I don't think he's going to make any kind of real substantive military concessions that affect the battlefield in Ukraine and ultimately Europe's long-term position. Look, at this point, I think the one that troubles me the most is the root causes argument that keeps coming up from Putin. He's basically trying to form a justification here, not just for Ukraine, but a future justification to say to Estonia, you're a root cause. Lithuania, you're a root cause. Poland, you are a root cause. Finland, you especially, since you just joined NATO, are a root cause. I mean, so if the U.S. allows this to happen, if NATO allows it to happen, for the for the tail to be pinned on, the NATO donkey is the cause of all of this, I think the future repercussions of it are serious and likely just Putin condition building for future action. So I don't see him making any substantive concessions here. I think he'll remain maximalist because I think he thinks he's winning. I mean, it does not help when a U.S. president basically says Ukraine doesn't have any cards. Why would he, concede anything at this point? Trump is telling him publicly, at least, you've got nothing to fear about losing.
From your perspective, then, what kind of strategy should Ukraine take? Because it seems that Putin is not ready for any concessions, and we still have some pressure from the U.S. side, especially with the idea of ceding Donbass to Russia.
Yeah, no, I think Ukraine needs to keep doing what they're doing. Look, getting confrontational with Donald Trump is not going to help. Now, behind closed doors, that's fine. You can't do that publicly. I think what you have to keep doing is understanding that there are basically two factions, even though they claim there's not. You've got the Steve Whitkoff and Jared Kushner faction that's trying to look at this more as a business deal and get it done on those terms. And then you have Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who understands this is a bigger, broader strategic issue that will affect the U.S., not just in the years ahead, but decades ahead in terms of what the U.S. agrees to here. And Ukraine has to keep working towards that end, expressing to him what the red lines are for Ukraine. And if you're Ukraine, that means you're not going to cede territory. Yeah, look, there may be a freezing of this conflict along the lines, and we may be talking inches as opposed to feet in terms of how certain lines get drawn and concessions there. But that's just a frontline reality. That's not a secession of entire territories. Because if you look at that map, as John was saying, that fortress belt that is in the heart of your country, protecting Kiev from sweeping maneuver, should the Russians break out and be able to march on Kiev, there are no other fortifications of, significance beyond that. You can't afford to give that up or you'd make your country indefensible. So I think Ukraine needs to keep doing the same. I think, though, that what Ukraine needs to do with its European partners, the other more important part of this equation is basically to say, look, it's time for you to act. Enough meetings, enough saying you're going to do this, enough, theorizing as to how best to do this. Our energy, just as an example, Ukraine's energy infrastructure is under attack. They need transformers. They need mobile transformers. They need, supplies, equipments, et cetera, to keep repairing that. They need air defense assets to protect it. They need more batteries, more missiles for the Patriots, for the NASAMS and the like. These are all things that Europe could be substantively doing. And as John and I keep repeatedly calling for, the biggest thing that Europe could do to show that they've got skin in this game is immediately, not tomorrow, and not next week, not a year from now, get a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine so that Ukraine can start protecting more of its energy infrastructure and start putting more of its air defense assets forward to protect its troops on the front lines.
The Russian president continues to insist that his forces have fully captured Kupiansk. John, as you already mentioned, that there is no capturing of Pokrovsk. I would like to hear your opinion. What is really happening on the Eastern Front right now?
Well, what's really happening on the Eastern Front is that Russia continues to commit manpower. Putin is convinced that he can attrit Ukrainian forces, one in personnel, two in manpower overall, and then also deplete their munitions. He just believes that he can continue to push forward, and maybe he can. As Mark would say, meters at a day at a cost of thousands a week. But the human life is not a calculus that he takes into effect when he makes his decision. His decision is continue to apply pressure, and in addition to applying pressures, continue to push a narrative that he is winning, that his ground forces are securing terrain, that Ukrainian soldiers are surrendering, that Ukrainian soldiers are leaving their defensive positions. That's the narrative he wants to project. That's the narrative he wants the rest of the world, to include Russia, but also the West, to accept, and to get them to accept a peace deal on his terms. Now, what we've also seen this past week is, once again, he has committed the 2026 budget to put Russia on a wartime economy. He has raised the value-added taxes to increase revenue. He has announced the formation of a buffer zone And he's also announced the formation of a new military group, a northern military group. So he wants to project strength. He wants people to believe that Russia is in a position that they have strength today and that they're going to have strength tomorrow to threaten NATO. That's what he wants. The reality on the ground, quite simply, is he doesn't have it. The other reality, quite frankly, as Mark stated very correctly, is that in order for Ukraine to get any breathing room, they're going to have to stop or put an end to these deep strikes that are occurring within their territory, the ballistic missiles. And yes, an air defense shield on the ground, but also that sky shield that Europe's been talking about now for 6 to 8 months needs to be put into effect. They're not going to be able to win a ground war if they can't defend themselves from the air.
Hey, Sophia, if I could just quickly add on here to John, everything that he said, absolutely. The other thing that we're probably seeing happening here is the Russians coming out and saying Pokrovsk and Volchansk having fallen. That's all about their calculus with Whitkoff and Jared Kushner. As best we can tell, there's no military advisor accompanying them today to these negotiations in Russia. And so they're hoping to play off their naivete and basically say to them and think that they're not going to double check it, that these cities have fallen. Look, we're taking battlefield gains. Look, that's why our positions are stronger than you think, and you've got to take our side of it. A lot of that is condition setting for these, negotiations in Moscow. Ukraine was quick to come out through the disinformation agency or ministry, if you will, and deny it, that those two cities remain under Ukrainian, partial control at least.
Yeah, let me just add one more thing to that as we boomerang back and forth and converse. Exactly what Mark said. The two people that are missing from these negotiations are, one, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, right? The commander of NATO forces is not present, at least in the negotiations. Maybe in the back room, discussions, maybe via secure VTC with the White House, but that man is not present. The other man is not present is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? The senior military advisor to the president. What we have right now, what we see out front, and what Putin more importantly sees, is an economic solution. And these businessmen, if you want to call them that, do not understand the strategic ramifications of decisions that they're agreeing to by a Russian negotiators who do know exactly what they are doing and how they want to achieve conditions for future fights. So it's imperative that a military person sit on there that can explain to a Kushner or explain to a Whitkoff, hey, yes, I understand what you're trying to do, but let's understand what could happen 2 to 3 years from now with that decision. And until we see military people sitting at the table, I think we're only going to see, as the Wall Street Journal said, is economic conditions driving the train, not national security and the security of Eastern Europe.
So then, do you think this negotiation team basically put in a weak position the U.S. administration, because it seems that without military advisories, Russians will basically tell the same kind of truth as they did it before?
It's a blind spot, and it's a blind spot that these two negotiators fail to recognize. It's also a blind spot that they fail to recognize that they're dealing with very skilled, negotiators on the Russian side, but also intelligence operators who understand, who have probably done a lot of background work into both of these gentlemen, Whitkoff and Kushner, and they understand what their strengths and weaknesses are, and they understand how to exploit them. They are going into an unfair battle. And without that military advisor sitting there helping them understand what type of ramifications are going to be involved, those consequences, those second and third order effects, they're going in blind. And unfortunately, they're knowingly going in blind.
Yeah, I would quickly add here, Sophia, if I could. It's not that they're just going in blind, because they are, but this is the decision that Trump wants to make. This is the approach that he wants to make. He wants to negotiate this on a business-like basis. And that's what's so astounding about this. It's not just that Putin and them are getting their way in terms of how these negotiations play out and based on what terms, is that Trump is naively, in terms of looking at the U.S. national security needs going forward, negotiating on business terms, and in many ways repeating the same mistakes that Europe made decades, in the making here, of basically saying, hey, let's do business. I'll fund the next Russian war against the West. It's madness.
Given the difficult battlefield conditions, the ongoing large-scale strikes across Ukraine, especially during winter, and it's crucial for Ukrainian energy system, and also the recent scandal corruption here in Ukraine. Mark, how critical is this moment for Kyiv in terms of seeking an end to the war?
Yeah, I think this is the time that, Thomas Paine, in talking about the American Revolution, said, these are the times that try men's souls. But I would remind Ukraine, look, you're a country that for decades lived under Soviet-style corruption. And yes, there's corruption in Ukraine, but you're making the right strides to try to extricate yourself from that going forward. The people took to the streets when there was concern that Nabu and the Soviet would be eliminated, saying, no, we don't want to go back to a Soviet-style government that was, essentially corrupt at every level. So I would say to Ukraine, stay strong, stay focused on ridding yourself of corruption. There's still more to be done. But look, the U.S. was extremely corrupt during World War II as well. It happens. It was war profiteering here. In your case, it might be these kickbacks. It's serious. But I think what Ukraine cannot lose sight of is, as I've said to John privately many times, you can't lose a country for $100 million in kickbacks. You can't make strategic decisions based on the criminal decisions. If it turns out to be the case, once proven in court, you can't make strategic decisions of a country based on a $100 million crime. You need to be making them on terms of what secures the rights, the sovereignty, et cetera, of your country for the long term, and to make sure that this war never returns and that you're left in a position that Russia can't possibly ever attack you again.
And to add to this topic, I just want to hear your opinion about security guarantees for Ukraine. John, do you believe that these guarantees should how they should look like from the United States, and maybe you can also tell us about the role which Europe should play here?
Yeah, I firmly believe, and Mark and I talk about this a lot. We've written about this a lot too. The only security guarantee that matters, okay, is NATO forces physically in Ukraine. That is the one guarantee that Russia pushes back on the absolute most. They do not want NATO forces there because they know if they attack, they will have to fight NATO forces. They're okay with NATO forces being on the NATO side of the border because, quite frankly, they understand that NATO will not commit initially. They will have to get approval through Article 5 or Article 4 proceedings. Then NATO countries have to agree to it. So it could take days, weeks, months before NATO responds. The only way that there is a security guarantee that's lasting is NATO forces in Ukraine, defending Ukraine from defensive positions. I just don't see it any other way, quite frankly. And Russia doesn't either, okay, which is why they are so adamant against it. And we really need to understand that. And we need to push to get those forces on the ground. If you're going to have a lasting peace, it's going to have to involve forces being on the ground, not on the opposite side of the border.
Mark, how do you assess the reports suggesting that as a part of a potential peace plan, Ukraine may ultimately have to abandon its aspirations for NATO membership, even if only in an indirect form? And what would that actually mean for Ukraine's future and also long-term security landscape here in Eastern Europe?
Look, yeah, Ukraine can decide for itself whether it wants to apply for NATO membership, but it can't arbitrarily say that, they're not NATO. They can't tell NATO that you can reject or accept a future request from us to join the organization. Plus, NATO would be, fools to give Russia that kind of veto power over who can join the defense alliance. So they're not going to do that. Mark Rutte has already made that clear. Major European countries have said that's a starter for us. They're not going to give, effective control of NATO to Putin. And that's what you're trying to see here. So I don't think that it's going to happen. I think in terms, just real quickly to circle back, that Ukraine shouldn't do that they shouldn't agree to it. I think to circle back quickly to what John was saying, though, in terms of the security guarantees themselves, is if Trump is now allegedly saying that an attack on Ukraine, as part of this peace deal being presented to Putin today, if an attack on Ukraine is considered an attack on NATO, why not just make them NATO? Because as John said, there's all kinds of reasons why, delays, et cetera, if NATO forces are outside of Ukraine. But if they're inside of Ukraine, then you know that there's likely not to be a conflict, that it's going to stay static. But of course, Putin doesn't want that because it tells us everything. Look, the security guarantees tells us anything and everything that we need to know about what Putin's intent is going forward. The fact that he's being maximalist and saying that they really can't exist with any kind of meat to them tells you he is going to invade your country again. And that's got to be the starting point and the ending point for Ukraine in these negotiations. Putin is not done with you, no matter how much he may say, however much business he may do with Russia, with Trump in a, post-war period before he comes back at you again. But he's not done with Ukraine. He still wants it all.
He's not done with Ukraine. And one more point to add to that is, look, Ukraine's learned about security agreements from the Budapest Memorandum. Okay, they understand that agreement's only as good as the next leader that comes into the country, unless it's a binding treaty, okay, that actually commits countries to get involved. And I think they're working on that, a binding treaty, but binding treaties will still take people to make decisions. And the last thing the NATO forces want to do is get into a meeting engagement, have to cross a border to go attack a defending enemy. Okay, and that's what that does. So the Budapest Memorandum is a strong lesson learned, but the bigger lesson learned, I believe, is Chechnya, where the Russians agreed to a ceasefire peace deal, only to come back 2 years later to overrun the country and to wipe out the leadership. So once bitten, twice shy, as the expression goes in Budapest. The Budapest Memorandum is that, and Ukraine would be well served to remember both of those incidents.
Thank you for both of you for being with us today and for your insights and position.
Hey, Sophia, thanks for having us back on. Hopefully next time we meet under better circumstances.
Thank you, Sophia. Take care, stay safe, and Slava Ukraini.